He left her for a younger woman. No warning, just a note on the fridge. He thought he was starting over, but 3 months later, he showed up in court and broke down in tears when he learned the truth. She owned everything: the house, business, the accounts, even the name on the door. This isn't a story of revenge. It's about quiet strength, legal precision, and a woman who never raised her voice because she didn't need to. If you've ever been underestimated, this story will stay with you. What would you do if the person who walked away had no idea what they left behind? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The house was too quiet. Not the kind of quiet that feels peaceful, but the kind that makes the walls sound hollow. She kicked off her shoes like always, placed her keys in the bowl by the door like always, and paused at the sound of the refrigerator humming. Something about it felt louder than usual, maybe because it was the only sound left. There was a note stuck to it, folded once, torn from a yellow legal pad. "I'm sorry, I can't do this anymore. I've met someone else." The handwriting was unmistakable, tilted slightly to the right, rushed but careful with the loops. He always wrote his 7 South with a crossbar ever since his engineering classes back in college. She stared at the paper without reaching for it, as if touching it would make it real. The ink was fresh. The paper hadn't curled yet, which meant he'd left not long before she came home. The dog leash still hung by the door. His toothbrush still sat in the cup in the bathroom. And yet, the note was final. She stood there for a long time. Long enough that the refrigerator kicked on again and then back off. Long enough for the light in the kitchen window to change from soft gold to a dull gray. He hadn't taken much. A few drawers in the dresser were open, but not empty. The medicine cabinet still had his allergy pills, his shaving cream, even the bottle of cologne he'd only wear when they went somewhere nice. She noticed those things in passing, not because she was looking, but because the gaps felt louder than they should have. The absence of motion, of someone humming badly while making coffee. Of that stupid sound his slippers made on the Tylenol of it settled into the house like dust. She made tea without thinking, only realizing she'd filled 2 mugs when she turned to put them on the counter. She poured one back into the kettle and placed it in the sink. She didn't cry. Not yet. The envelope on the table, marked urgent and postmarked 2 weeks ago, caught her eye. She opened it because it gave her something to do. Divorce packets. Not from a lawyer at least not at first glance, but a self-help kit, the kind people print from websites when they think it'll be amicable. He'd filled out half of it. Her name was typed at the top of every page. His was already signed on several lines. The phone stayed silent. No missed calls, no text to explain, just the note. She checked the garage. His car was gone, but his toolbox and golf clubs were still there. The lawn mower he always complained about sat in its usual place, blades probably still clogged with last week's clippings. He hadn't cleaned out his drawers. He hadn't left any boxes behind, just the 3 lines and her name already written on papers she hadn't asked for. At some point, she sat on the floor, not dramatically, just because her legs no longer wanted to carry her. The tiles felt cold. The kettle whistled again, and she turned it off without pouring anything. It wasn't the fact that he left. It was how he left. No conversation, no argument, not even the pretense of trying to fix something. Just a yellow note, torn unevenly at the bottom, taped to the fridge with a magnet that said Chicago 2010, the trip they'd taken for their 5th anniversary, the one where they bought matching sweatshirts and danced in an empty street. When it started to rain, taped there like it meant nothing. She took the note down, read it again. "I'm sorry, I can't do this anymore. I've met someone else." That was it. 12 years. A house, a business. To rescue dogs. 6 nieces and nephews who called her Auntie M, even though they weren't hers. All boiled down to 3 lines. She folded the paper carefully, smoothed the creases, and placed it in the drawer where the spare batteries and rubber bands lived. That. Then she stood up, not because she felt strong, but because the light was fading and someone had to lock the doors. It was late, one of those nights where sleep wouldn't come, and the quiet buzz of the house made everything feel too sharp. She reached for her phone, not because she wanted to scroll, but because she didn't want to think. She opened Instagram. Without meaning to, her thumb moving out of habit more than intention. It was muscle memory now. One flick, one swipe, one tap hand. There it was, a photo, a sunset, a beach she didn't recognize, and two people standing ankle-deep in the water. He was smiling, not the smile he used in holiday cards or when people said "say cheese." This one was smaller, the one he used when something pleased him just enough to feel like a secret. It was the same smile he'd given her once years ago while watching her read on the couch under a blanket she'd knitted. During their first winter in the house, she didn't recognize the woman beside him. Not at first, but the caption tagged her. A username she didn't know. A profile that, when tapped, showed pictures filled with blue drinks, tropical flowers, and filtered views of places he'd once said were too commercial. Looked young, too young. Long hair, perfect skin, not a wrinkle in sight. She posed like she'd practiced. She smiled like the world owed her something. The timestamp was what froze her. It was dated a week before the note appeared on the refrigerator. A full 7 days before, he said, "I've met someone else." Which meant he hadn't just met her, he'd planned the trip, packed for it, boarded a plane, held another woman's hand under a sky that didn't belong to her. She clicked through the photos, one after another, a poolside breakfast, matching robes, a dinner where 2 champagne flutes glinted under soft light. He was in at least half of them, always leaning in, always smiling. She looked for a wedding ring, but couldn't tell he'd stopped wearing his a few months ago, claiming the band irritated his skin. It wasn't anger that came first. It was the peculiar kind of numbness that arrives when the world shifts so suddenly that the furniture in your mind doesn't quite fit anymore. She stared at the screen, then zoomed in on a picture of them standing in front of a resort sign. Her name wasn't in the caption, but the location was. She checked their shared credit card account. The charges were their flights, hotel, spa treatments. It hadn't been hidden. He didn't bother to cover his tracks. Or maybe he didn't care if she found them. Maybe that was the point. The woman's smile wasn't cruel, exactly, but it wasn't kind either. It had the shine of someone who hadn't been through much yet, the look of someone who didn't know the cost of building a life with another person, someone who hadn't spent nights folding laundry while waiting for a man to come home from meetings that went too long, someone who didn't know how tired love could get when stretched over years. She stared at the screen until her eyes hurt. Then she set the phone down gently, as if it might break under the weight of what she now knew. He hadn't just left her. He had replaced her, and not with someone better, just newer. She thought about the woman's manicure, the way her fingers curled around the stem of a cocktail glass in one of the photos. She remembered when her own hands used to look like that before. Dish soap, garden soil, and years of typing wore the softness away. She pressed her palms together and studied them. Nothing special, just working hands. She didn't check the woman's profile again for days. When she finally did, the vacation photos had been replaced with blurry selfies and brunches in places. That felt expensive but hollow. Her ex appeared in fewer pictures, and when he did, his smile didn't reach the eyes anymore. But that first image, the beach, the ankle-deep water, the sun catching the curve of his cheek as he leaned in close, that one stayed with her, not because it hurt, but because it made everything clear. She hadn't lost something he had. It arrived on a Monday, tucked between a credit card offer and the grocery store flyer. The envelope was thicker than anything else in the box, and stiff, the paper heavy and official. She noticed the return address for Superior Court of Civil Division and paused before opening the mailbox all the way. The wind picked up just enough to make the corner of the envelope flutter, and for a second she just stood there, staring. She knew what it was. There were no surprises anymore, only confirmations. Inside the kitchen, she placed it on the table. Without opening it, she made tea, washed 1 cup, folded a dish towel, and then sat down in the chair that had once been his. It still squeaked if you leaned to the left. She didn't fix it. Some things were better left unchanged. When she finally opened the envelope, the contents spilled out in orderly precision. Forms, disclosures, notices of appearance, a typed letter with her full name in bold, followed by language that was both clinical and cold. He was filing for divorce formally. 3 months after the note, 91 days to be exact. The letter stated his intent to dissolve the marriage amicably and proposed a division of assets based on what he claimed to be fair and equitable. The list that followed didn't surprise her, but the tone did. It was as though they were strangers negotiating the return of shared furniture after a house fire. No mention of years, no acknowledgement of history. Just itemized lines: car, retirement accounts, shared property, business interests, business interests. That was the part that made her chest tighten. She read the paragraph 3 times. He referred to the business as jointly created and maintained, with a proposed 50-50th split of all its assets and intellectual property. He listed inventory, branding rights, supplier contracts, and customer lists, things she'd built with her own hands, one order at a time. Back when the business was nothing more than candles poured in their kitchen after dinner, she remembered the early days. How he'd told her to register it under her name for tax purposes. How he insisted she take the title of sole proprietor while he helped in the background. How he praised her on social media for being a self-made woman, kind of wife who could build something from scratch. She had believed him, trusted that the structure he created was for their protection. Now it felt like a setup. She flipped through the rest of the paperwork. He had an attorney, a downtown firm, expensive from the look of the letterhead. The language throughout the documents was polished but aggressive positioning. Framing, anticipating resistance. There was a deadline. 2 weeks to respond. She reread the part about the house. He claimed it was a marital asset to be liquidated and divided. Never mind that it was her parents who'd left her the down payment in their will. Never mind that his name had never appeared on the deed. She placed the papers back in the envelope, folded the flap, and stared out the kitchen window. The backyard was quiet. The hydrangeas were beginning to yellow, just like they always did at the end of summer. The garden didn't care what was happening inside. For a moment, she imagined herself walking away, letting the lawyers handle it, signing what needed to be signed and starting over somewhere else. But the feeling passed quickly, not because she wanted to fight, but because something deeper had taken root over the past few months, something steady and slow-burning. She reached for her laptop and opened a new browser tab. Not to search for another attorney, she already had someone in mind, a woman who'd helped a friend during a property dispute last year, quiet, sharp, and unshakable. Then she opened her business folder. Not the shared one on their old desktop. Her own files, the ones with receipts, contracts, and emails stretching back a decade. He'd filed paperwork, she would file truth. The paper had been folded into thirds, sealed in a manila envelope, and presented with a glass of champagne. They were sitting on the hotel balcony in Maui. The air was warm, salty, and sweet from the scent of plumeria. He handed her the envelope, like it was a souvenir, laughing as he did it. "Just something for the files," he'd said. "Formality," my dad insisted. She had looked at him then, her new husband, still sunburned from their snorkeling trip, still wearing the white linen shirt from their beach dinner. His eyes were soft, familiar, and when she opened the envelope and saw the title, Prenuptial Agreement, she blinked once and said nothing. He kept talking, casual and easy. Something about how his father's accountant said it was standard. Days. How couples who were smart about money talked about these things up front. "It's not about trust," he told her, reaching for her hand. "It's just ... protocol." She asked why they hadn't done this before the wedding. He shrugged, said it slipped his mind, said it was rushed with the planning, and besides, it was still valid if she signed now. "Don't overthink it," he said, with that voice he used when he wanted to put things to rest. There were no lawyers present, no witnesses, just the waves in the distance and a notepad from the resort beneath the folder. The pen he gave her was the same one they'd used to sign postcards to their families. The night before, she hadn't read every word at 26. She was still full of the kind of trust that came easily to someone raised to believe love was an anchor, not a gamble. She'd watched her parents grow old in the same house they'd bought after their wedding. They'd paid off the mortgage by year 15 and planted peonies out front every spring. Her mother used to say, "Marry someone you'd trust with a shovel and your last dollar." And she had believed that's who he was. The agreement was brief, 3 pages, typed in legal format, but without the heavy language she would later come to recognize. It outlined that any personal property brought into the marriage would remain with the original owner, that financial accounts in individual names would stay that way, that any business ventures launched jointly would be considered separate unless explicitly filed as joint ownership. He had emphasized that part. "You're the creative one," he said. "If you ever start something amazing, It should be yours. I'd never want to take half of what you built." It had felt like a compliment, a gesture of fairness. She hadn't yet learned that paperwork spoken of in kindness could still be wielded in coldness. She signed it that night. The champagne went flat on the table. He kissed her shoulder and said she'd never need to think about it again. Years later, in the small conference room at her lawyer's office, she watched as the same 3 pages were printed again, this time on legal letterhead. Through it silently, lips tightening around the second paragraph. "You signed this after the wedding?" she asked, eyes narrowing. "Yes," she replied. "On our honeymoon," her lawyer nodded, slowly, and he presented it casually. "Number counsel?" "No," he said, it was a formality. She leaned back in her chair, folding the papers gently. "He gave you a gift," she said. "He just didn't realize it." Because buried in the final paragraph, something he must have copied from a generic online form, was a clause stating that any assets earned in the name of one party during the marriage, if uncontested for a period of 5 years, would default to that party's full ownership unless legally amended. He had written that in to protect himself. But the business had been filed under her name, her social security number, her bank account, since 2009. He had assumed she'd never read it, and maybe she wouldn't have. But now she was reading everything. She hadn't touched the closet in months, not since he left, and certainly not since the papers arrived. His things had remained untouched on the right side, suits still hanging in plastic dry cleaner sleeves, dress shoes lined up beneath the hem of his wool coat, belts still looped over the hanger rod. She'd ignored it all at first, avoided that side like it was radioactive. But now that the case was moving forward, her lawyer needed a list. "Inventory what remains," she'd said, "even if he claims it's not his anymore." So she bought boxes, sturdy ones with folding lids and reinforced bottoms, the kind you buy when you know things are going into storage, not just transit. She labeled each one in neat black marker. Clothing, memorabilia, miscellaneous. She didn't want to linger, didn't want to sort by sentiment. One box was half filled with button-down shirts and a pair of jeans she hadn't seen him wear in years when she reached up for the top shelf. A pair of mismatched gloves tumbled down, followed by a rolled-up poster from his college days. She caught the corner of a small black folder, leather-bound, zippered dot. It was heavier than it looked. She unzipped it carefully. Inside were a few wrinkled documents, printouts from old email chains, bank deposit slips, and business cards from people she didn't recognize. But it was the receipt, tucked between them, creased, faded, and still faintly sticky, that made her stop. It was from a notary office, dated 2009. The itemized note read, "LLC filing, business registration, and sole ownership declaration." The name of the business was hers. The filing fee had been paid in cash, and beneath the signature line was her name printed but not signed. The signature instead belonged to him. She stared at it for a long time. Not because she didn't understand, but because she did. He had filed the business registration for her, used her name, but signed it himself. She remembered that week now she'd been overwhelmed by orders from a craft fair, trying to get the website off the ground. He told her, "Not to worry about the paperwork. I'll take care of it," he said. "You just keep creating." At the time, it had felt like love. Now, it felt like something else. Her name was on every legal line. Hers was the name tied to the tax ID, the domain registration, the vendor contracts. But this receipt told a different story, that he had placed her name there with intention, not as a partner, but as a shield. He had wanted the business in her name from the beginning, not as a gift, but as insulation. She had unknowingly become the legal owner of an asset he thought would always remain under his control. She folded the receipt and set it aside. Suddenly aware of how heavy the air had become, beneath the folder, she found an old shoebox filled with college memorabilia trophies from debate competitions, fraternity pins, a yellowed graduation program. Tucked beneath it all was a photo from their first apartment. They were young, leaning against the kitchen counter, flour on their hands from an attempt at homemade pizza. He was smiling. She was laughing, mouth open, unaware of the camera. She looked free. She placed the photo in the miscellaneous box. The receipt she kept, she taped. She taped the boxes shut, one by one. Not harshly, not in anger, just firmly, with a kind of finality that comes when you understand something deeper than disappointment. When she was done, she lined them up by the hallway. She didn't send a message. She didn't need to. Let him call when he was ready to. Collect his things. Let him open those boxes one day and feel the shift. Because 30 years of shared history had been neatly packed, labeled, and moved aside. And one thin, yellowed receipt might be the most valuable thing in the entire house. She had started the candle shop as something to do with her hands. At first, it was just a way to unwind after work, melting wax on the stove, mixing in essential oils, experimenting with jars she found at thrift stores, lavender and cedar, bergamot and black tea. The first dozen batches were uneven and burned too fast, but she kept at it. In the evenings, she'd sit at the kitchen table with newspaper laid out and pour until her wrists ached. Back then, she listed the candles on Etsy under a simple username, not thinking anyone beyond a handful of strangers would ever see them. But within 6 months, orders started to pick up. People liked the way she blended scents, said the candles reminded them of their grandmother's kitchen or the first day of autumn. She took photos in natural light, wrote little notes to go in each box. It was slow work, but it felt honest. He noticed the momentum before she did. "This is more than a hobby," he said. One evening, watching her print shipping labels at the dining room table, "You've got something here." She smiled at him, thinking it was sweet that he believed in her. "We should make it official," he added. She hesitated. Official, a business, a real one, with structure, protection. She wasn't sure she needed any of that. The candles barely covered the cost of supplies, but he had always been the one who thought 10 steps ahead. He worked in logistics. Then, always reading about business strategy and liability shielding, he brought home folders with tabs and highlighters. He said if she was going to sell something, she needed to protect herself. "Put it under your name," he said. "Makes sense, you're the heart of it." So she did. In 2009, they sat at the kitchen table, the same one where she made the first batch, and he typed up all the necessary forms. She remembered watching him lean over the laptop, glasses low on his nose, the blue glow of the screen reflecting off his wedding band. He made it sound like he was giving her something precious. "We'll file it as an LLC," he explained. "You'll be the owner. It keeps it clean for taxes and gives you flexibility." He filled out every line, printing her name in the spaces where ownership and registration were required. She skimmed the pages, trusting him to know what needed to be done. When he asked her to sign, she did without asking questions, without knowing how those forms would become important years later. The business license came in the mail 2 weeks later. It had her name on the top in bold, Emily W. Langford. Owner GOT, she framed it, hung it in the tiny room they called an office. Even though it was just a repurposed walk-in closet, orders increased. They bought supplies in bulk. He built her a website, learned how to track sales, set up spreadsheets with forecasts and expense categories. She still made every candle by hand, still wrote every thank you note, but now it was growing faster than she could manage on her own. He took care of the banking, opened a business account, put her name on every line. "It's yours," he said again and again. Even when they hired 2 part-time packers to help during holiday rushes, even when the business outgrew the dining room and they rented a small workspace on Oak Street. Even when people started calling her an entrepreneur, but the tone shifted over time. By 2015, he began referring to it as our business in conversations. Then the business, as if it belonged to no one in particular. At dinner with friends, he told stories that made it sound like he'd built it from the ground up. She let it slide, corrected him only once. He waved it off with a laugh. Semantics. He said, "We're a team," but the paperwork never changed. Her name stayed on every tax form, every bank account, every vendor agreement. She didn't think about it much until now, until lawyers started asking questions, until she found the receipt, until she realized that while he'd used her name for convenience, she had, by law, remained the sole owner all along. He built the frame, but she had built everything inside it. In the beginning, it felt like a partnership. She mixed the wax, blended the scents, and poured them into jars with steady hands and careful thought. He handled the rest, shipping supplies, bulk orders, spreadsheets she didn't know how to format. It worked, like a well-worn routine they didn't need to discuss. She had her corner of the house with the melting pots and fragrance bottles. He had his laptop open on the couch, cross-checking vendor invoices and tracking shipping rates. They didn't call it a division of labor, they just called it their life. It wasn't until much later that she realized what had quietly taken shape in the background. Every form he submitted, every application he filled out, every renewal, every permit, he'd done them all with her name at the top. She remembered signing a few when he needed her actual signature, but most things didn't require it. The online registrations, the filings, the forms for the state, they all listed her as the sole proprietor. Not out of ceremony or pride, just because that's how he set it up. He told her it was easier that way. Streamlined, he'd said, when she asked once if it should be in both their names. You're the product, you're the voice. No one's buying my logistics there. Buying your story, at the time, it made sense. He'd always had a way of explaining things in a tone that made you feel like questioning him would only slow down progress. And she trusted him. It was her business after all. She was the one. At the holiday markets, the one who responded to every message from customers asking about wick types and burn times. The one who handwrote cards to include in every order. He built out the QuickBooks profile. She never really learned how to use it. When suppliers needed tax information, he emailed from her account. She'd find emails drafted in her name, ready to send. She just clicked send and moved on. Sometimes she wondered after the fact whether he ever felt the weight of it, that all his work, the spreadsheets, the calls, the price comparisons was propping up something that didn't technically belong to him, but he never said a word. Not when they hit their first six-figure year. Not when they opened a booth at the regional trade show and people started placing bulk orders. Not when they signed a lease on the Oak Street warehouse, he posed for photos with her at the booth, told reporters he was just the guy behind the curtain, smiled like it didn't matter that every check they received was addressed to her name. And maybe it didn't back then. But something changed after the second holiday season in the warehouse. He started asking more questions about branding, about expansion, about automation. He floated the idea of hiring a fulfillment partner. So you don't get stuck in the weeds, he said. You're bigger than this now. She said no. He didn't push, not directly. But he started handling more without asking design tweaks on the website. Changes to the packaging, contracts she didn't remember reviewing. He claimed he was scaling, but it felt like drift. A quiet shift from collaboration to quiet. Control still, her name never left the paperwork. Even when he opened a line of credit, he used her authorization. When they filed for a business grant through the state, her signature was on the award letter. When they renewed their wholesale contracts, vendors addressed her directly. He moved the pieces. She remained the board. The realization struck hardest when she began gathering documents for her lawyer. She opened the file cabinet she rarely used, flipping through tabs he'd labeled years ago. Her name was everywhere. Not as a partner, but as the only legal and financial owner. Every form, every agreement, every asset, he had placed her at the center. And now, in trying to claim what he thought was half his, he was discovering he didn't legally exist within the business at all. He had invested time, skill, effort, but ownership that had always been hers. The email came late in the afternoon, terse and formal, with no greeting. It was from his new attorney, someone she'd never met, but whose name carried the kind of authority that made people sit up straighter. Attached was a request for documents, tax records, financial statements, quarterly revenue breakdowns, inventory reports. It was signed with a flourish and a deadline. They were asking for everything. The tone wasn't angry. It was confident in a way that assumed entitlement. That spoke as if the only thing standing in the way of a clean split was her willingness to comply. She forwarded it to her lawyer, who replied with a single sentence, "Let me handle this." Still, she couldn't ignore the strange thud in her chest. It wasn't fear. It was something more familiar. A kind of dull ache that reminded her of all the years when everything financial had passed through his hands first. He was the one who liaised with the accountant, the one who handled taxes, renewals, filings. She knew her name was on everything, but she had no idea how deep their records went, so she made an appointment. The accountant's office hadn't changed. Same neutral carpet, same coffee table magazines, still months out of date. The receptionist, greeted her with a warm smile and a quiet understanding in her eyes. She didn't ask questions, just led her to the back where Alan sat at his desk, like always, pen in hand. A man who had made his career by noticing everything and saying very little. He had worked with them since the beginning, since the days when she was still handwriting labels and he was logging shipping costs on the back of receipts. Alan had seen the business grow, slowly at first, then quickly. He had never said much, but she remembered how he once called her after their second year and said, "You're going to want a better filing system." She sat down. He looked over his glasses. "I saw the message from his attorney," he said. Nodded, he opened a folder. Inside were printouts, spreadsheets, signatures, pages and pages neatly arranged. He didn't slide them across the desk, he just looked at them for a moment, then said, very softly, "It's not his to touch." 6 words. The room felt still. "What do you mean?" she asked, though she already had a sense. Alan leaned back. He helped, no question there. He organized, managed, maybe even strategized. But every document, every filing, every official declaration from the start, it's in your name. He set it up that way, either out of trust or design. Doesn't matter now. Legally, it's yours. She blinked. But the taxes, filed under your business ID, paid from your account, he used your authorization for everything. It was never co-owned, not even once. Even his expense reimbursements were paid out as contractor support. Contractor, the word, landed like a pin on glass, so he can't claim ownership. Alan paused, folding his hands. He can claim contribution. He can claim effort. He can try to argue value, but ownership? No, there's no paper trail that gives him that right. She looked down at the papers. Decades of numbers and lines, each one bearing her signature or her initials. "Will you testify if needed?" she asked. "If asked, I'll tell the truth," he replied, "but I don't think this will go that far. He may be loud right now, but people like him, they know when the paper's not on their side." She stood to leave, the folder unopened in front of him. "You want a copy of all this?" he asked. She nodded. He smiled faintly. "I figured." On her way out, the receptionist handed her a flash drive, small and black, tucked inside a plain envelope. In the car. She held it in her palm. Something about its size made her laugh, quietly and alone. So much of their life together, reduced to a device no bigger than a house key. She didn't text him, didn't gloat, she just drove home. Windows down, flash drive in the passenger seat, and a silence that no longer felt empty. It felt earned. The envelope was heavier than most mail. Thick paper, no logo, just her full name in small measured letters across the front. It came from the bank, one she'd been with for over a decade, but never paid much attention to. Most of her contact with them came in the form of monthly statements or occasional fraud alerts. Nothing personal, nothing deliberate, until now she slid it open at the kitchen counter, next to the kettle that had just finished boiling. The tea bag steeped in silence as she unfolded the letter and began to read. It was formal, careful in tone, and structured to avoid emotion. The kind of letter banks send when someone has asked for something they shouldn't have. This letter was in response to a request made the previous week by a third party, her ex-husband, through his legal representation, asking to be added as a co-signer to the business account. Not to view it, not to inquire, but to be granted equal access, with full authority to deposit, withdraw, modify, and close. The bank declined. The second paragraph explained why. After thorough review of the account, documentation and registration, records, including historical signatory authorizations and the original business formation documents, our records confirm that you, and you alone, are the sole authorized signer on this account and all related sub-accounts. No additional individuals are listed as beneficiaries, co-owners, or authorized users. She read that line twice. Then again, the last time she'd walked into that bank branch in person was to open a sub-account for wholesale transactions. He'd waited in the car while she signed the papers, texting her updates about parking meters and timing. It hadn't felt significant then. It had just been a Tuesday. The rest of the letter outlined next steps should she wish to add or remove anyone from the account. There were instructions, forms, phone numbers. It even closed with a gentle sentence thanking her for her continued business. She folded the letter slowly and placed it flat on the counter. Beside the tea that had gone cold, He had tried to take access. Quietly, without warning, without speaking to her, there was no message from him. No call, no explanation. Just an attempt to step into something that wasn't his. Maybe he assumed the history they shared gave him the right. Maybe he thought he could explain it away later if it worked. But the paper said no. Legally, financially, structurally it was hers. She stared out the window for a long time, watching two sparrows fight for space on the backyard fence. The same fence he'd said they'd fix one day. The same one, still leaning slightly to the left. The silence in the house no longer stung the way it used to. It felt fuller now, not with noise, but with clarity. She opened her laptop and scanned through her files. Every contract signed under her name. Every tax return filed with her social security number. Every renewal stamped with her signature. She hadn't built the structure to exclude him. She just never thought to include him. He was involved in the work, in the effort, but not in the ownership. That line had been drawn by the paperwork, quietly and years ago. She printed the letter and slid it into a folder labeled Legal Active. Then she poured the cold tea down the drain, turned on the kettle again, and made a fresh cup. This time, she stood still while the water boiled, steam rising into the quiet morning. He had tried to take access, and the bank had reminded him that she didn't need permission. The key was still missing from the hook by the back door, the small brass one with the blue rubber cover. She'd stopped noticing it after the first few weeks, too distracted by court filings and frozen accounts to think about something as small as a key. But on that Monday morning, standing by the door with her coffee in hand, her eyes landed on the empty spot again. And this time, it didn't pass. She checked the drawer, nothing. Checked her bag, just in case. Still nothing. It hadn't been returned. She hadn't asked for it, either not directly. In all their brief, tense communications through lawyers, there hadn't been a single mention of the spare key to the warehouse. Back when things were still working, when the business had grown too big for the garage and too messy for their living room, he was the one who found the space. A small warehouse with decent lighting and a monthly rate just low enough to feel manageable. They had driven out to tour it together. He liked the high ceilings. She liked the natural light that came in through the dusty windows. She remembered the day the lease was signed. They had gone to lunch afterward to celebrate. He held up the keys, one for her, one for him, and said, "Look at us, moving up in the world." Now, only hers remained. She hadn't been back to the warehouse over the weekend. Saturdays were too crowded with other tasks, and Sundays she tried to leave open. It was the one habit she still held onto a day with no obligations, no pouring, no emails, no bookkeeping. But when she arrived Monday morning, something was different. The back door wasn't latched properly. A faint breeze stirred the papers on the front table. Nothing was broken. Nothing was obviously missing, but the air felt used, like someone had passed through recently. She walked the perimeter slowly. Tools were still where she'd left them, shelves untouched. The register of materials matched what she remembered. But when she went to check the small box of petty cash in the drawer, the envelope inside was slightly open. She counted it out. $40 short. That night, she called. The property manager, he was kind, lived 2 hours away and usually only came by 4 inspections. But he'd had a camera installed above the back entrance after a minor break-in the year before. It was cheap, grainy footage. No audio, but it worked. He sent her the clip that same night. It was a Sunday. 6:42 p.m., a figure appeared in the frame. Tall, not him, a woman. She approached the door like she'd done it before. No hesitation. She used a key. The footage showed her entering, then leaving 35 minutes later with a canvas bag over one shoulder. Nothing dramatic, no prying, no damage. But it was enough. She didn't recognize the woman. Not from this angle, but her walk was confident, deliberate. This wasn't a mistake. Someone had given her access. The next morning, her lawyer sent a notice to his attorney, cease and desist, unauthorized entry. Formal warning, no response, but the silence spoke for itself. She changed the locks that afternoon, stood in the back alley while the locksmith worked, watching the old hardware get unscrewed and replaced. The sun dipped low as he tested the new set. She held the keys in her palm afterward, all identical, cool to the touch. Later that evening, she took the missing hook down from the wall by the back door. There was no reason to wait for it anymore. No reason to leave a space open for something that wasn't coming back. He hadn't returned the key, and in doing so, he'd confirmed exactly what she suspected all along. Some doors don't close gently, they have to be locked. The recommendation came from her lawyer, quietly passed across the table with a name scribbled on a legal pad. No fanfare, no hard sell just. You'll want someone like him. She folded the paper without reading it right away. It sat in her coat pocket for 2 days before she called the number. The voice that answered was low and efficient, as if time was already being measured. They agreed to meet the following morning at a small office above a tax prep chain. No signage, no receptionist, just a wooden door and a buzzer that clicked. Once, when pressed, he opened it himself. Gray suit, gray eyes, quiet handshake, no smile, no small talk. He simply gestured to the chair across from his desk and waited. She sat, clutching the envelope of documents she'd brought. Receipts, bank statements, copies of invoices that hadn't added up. He didn't ask why she was there. He let her speak first, and when she finally did, the words came carefully. "There's a history," she said, "a financial overlap, and I need to know if anything was taken that shouldn't have been." He didn't nod or offer comfort. He just opened a legal pad and began writing. "What access did he have?" he asked. "Most of it," she said, "but only in practice, not on paper." He looked up at that, just for a second, then back down. "I'll need full banking access," he said. "Digital copies, vendor lists, payroll history. The more noise you give me, the easier it is to find the signal." She handed over the flash drive Alan, the old accountant, had given her the week before. "Everything I have is on here," she said. He took it without comment and plugged it into a small, dusty laptop on the corner of his desk. While it loaded, he pulled out a yellow folder of forms. "You'll need to sign these," he said, "so I can correspond directly with institutions on your behalf." The forms were clean and clinical. Power of access, not power of attorney, temporary, scoped, exactly what she needed. It took less than 20 minutes to go through the paperwork. When she left, he said only, "I'll be in touch." 2 days passed, then 5. "You'll want to see this in person." She sat across from him again, but this time there was a printout waiting, a map of transactions, dated entries, source and destination, labeled in neat columns. At first glance, everything looked ordinary, until he pointed to a line drawn in red ink. "This account," he said, tapping the page with a pen, "isn't yours, but the funds came from yours." She leaned forward. The account was unfamiliar. A business checking account opened in the name of a consulting firm she'd never heard of. "Not illegal," he added, "but questionable. Especially since this firm doesn't exist, beyond a P.O. box and a single web page that lists no services." He handed her another page. "Mode transfers. Small amounts, weekly, enough to go unnoticed in a busy season. All documented. All from her business to the phantom consulting firm." He said roughly $126,000 her stomach. He flipped another page. "Here's where it gets interesting," he said. "Some of that money went right back into your business. Equipment, packaging, promotional materials, which means he may argue it was for growth. But some of it went here." He slid over a final page, a statement from a travel agency. Airline tickets, resort deposits, all marked with transaction IDs that matched withdrawals from the consulting firm's account. "He moved your money through something that didn't exist," the forensic accountant said calmly, "so he could spend it without your signature, showing up anywhere." She didn't speak for a long time, just stared at the paper. "I can prepare a report," he said, "clean, admissible, and built for litigation." She nodded slowly. "Do you want to confront him?" She looked down. At the final page again, a charge to a spa in Bali. "No," she said. "I want the court too." It was the pattern that gave it away. She hadn't noticed it before because it wasn't there, but because she hadn't been looking. The line items blurred into the background of her business expenses, buried between vendor payments and packaging, supply invoices. Each one was small, forgettable. A few hundred here, a few thousand there, never enough to raise flags on their own. But when the forensic accountant laid them all out in a single column, 52 entries spanning nearly 2 years, it became undeniable. Each withdrawal happened on a Friday, each labeled event expense, $200,000 in total. She sat at her kitchen table, the printed spreadsheet laid out in front of her, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. The heading at the top of the document read, Internal Financial Audit Discretionary Expenditures. But it may as well have said what he took. The accountant had highlighted the dates in yellow. She scanned them slowly. The amounts weren't uniform, some $600, some $4,000, but they occurred with rhythmic precision, like clockwork. Friday morning, sometimes afternoon, always posted within 24 hours. He had always been the one to manage event logistics, trade shows, pop-ups, promotional runs. It had seemed like a natural fit. He liked talking to people, liked printing banners and choosing booth layouts. She handled the product. He handled the presentation. He told her events were expensive, but necessary. He said it was just the cost of building a brand. She believed him. He showed her receipts when he felt like rental agreements for vendor tables, hotel bookings for weekend expos, catering for client mixers. It all looked legitimate. But now, with the records laid out, she saw something different. Only half of those withdrawals lined up with actual events. The others had no corresponding activity, no client meeting, no product launch, no booth, nothing. She checked the calendar archives, the email confirmations, even her own photos from events she remembered attending. The dates didn't match. The money had disappeared quietly. No fireworks, no sudden drop in the account, just a steady, quiet siphoning. Week by week, month by month, she flipped to the second page. The forensic accountant's notes were brief but damning. No receipts submitted for 21 of 52 transactions. No vendor correspondence to support labeled expenditures. Several cash withdrawals routed through mobile banking transferred to a secondary account, non-business affiliated. Total estimated misuse, $203,457.78. He hadn't just mismanaged money, he'd built a side channel, a quiet drain, and he'd done it methodically. Her eyes caught on one entry from 9 months prior, $3,200 labeled as Event Speaker Fee, West Coast Panel. She hadn't attended that panel. In fact, there hadn't been one. She'd been home that weekend with the flu. He said he was representing the brand alone. He brought back a tote bag, a lanyard, and a printed flyer that could have come from anywhere. It had all been a show, and now it was written down, cataloged, measured. She wondered how he would explain it, if he'd even try, if he'd claim the funds had been reinvested somehow. Even though the trail ended in airline tickets and credit card payments to places that had nothing to do with candles or fragrance. $200,000, she thought. About the cost of raw wax, of jars, of custom labels. Thought about the nights she stayed up until 2 in the morning to finish orders. The hours spent writing notes by hand when customers asked for gifts. The long drives to craft fairs. The winters when the warehouse was too cold to pour and she did it anyway. Fingers stiff in gloves. He'd spent that money like it came from nowhere. She picked up the pages, stacked them neatly, and placed them in a folder labeled Court Evidence. That evening, she didn't call him, she didn't yell. She simply opened her laptop, drafted an affidavit, and filed it through the court portal just before midnight on a Friday. Her name first appeared on an invoice buried between packaging costs and vendor renewals. At the time, it looked harmless, just another expense in the endless column of marketing costs that came with running a growing business. The label read, Consultation and Social Media Strategy, and the amount wasn't large enough to raise suspicion. A few $100s here, a few $100 there. She assumed it was some contractor he'd hired temporarily. Bring in freelancers to design seasonal labels or run ad campaigns. It wasn't unusual, but as she dug deeper, her name showed up again and again. Not once or twice, but on a recurring basis across nearly a year's worth of financial records. Each entry small enough to slip under the radar, but persistent enough to form a pattern. Always the same phrasing: consultation, strategy, brand development. No signed contract, no legal agreement, just a name and a growing list of payments. When the forensic accountant flagged the invoices, he asked a simple question: "Do you know her?" She said no, though the name sounded familiar. It wasn't until she searched through archived emails that she saw the connection. There she was, copied on promotional drafts and marketing proposals, her email signature attached like a watermark on every plan. She was using the company email address that had been set up for external communications, an address that only he had access to create. The consultant wasn't just giving advice. She was embedded in the day-to-day messaging of the business, shaping the tone, approving campaigns. In some of the emails, her ex had referred to her as the lead strategist, but she wasn't on payroll, at least not officially. The accountant showed her the payroll records. No W-9, no formal paychecks. Every payment to the woman was marked as a vendor expense rather than employee compensation. It was deliberate, a way to avoid the paperwork. That would have made the arrangement visible during tax season. She remembered one particular email, dated 3 months before the note on the refrigerator. It was addressed to a wholesale client, announcing a new promotional series. At the bottom of the email chain, the younger woman's words stood out. "I think we should position this as his vision, not hers." It sounds stronger that way. The words hit like a cold knife. Not only had she been working behind the scenes, but she had been erasing her subtly, line by line, shifting the narrative of the business from something she had built to something he supposedly led. The thought of it made her chest tighten. She had spent years pouring candles by hand, building relationships with customers, crafting the voice of the brand to feel personal and real. And now, a stranger was rewriting that story with a few calculated phrases in a promotional email. Her lawyer asked if she wanted to pursue the woman, directly send a cease and desist, maybe even a subpoena for involvement in financial misrepresentation. But she said no, not yet. The woman's name, invoices, and emails were already part of the record now. They would speak for themselves. She couldn't help but wonder, though, how much the younger woman knew. Was she just a consultant who'd fallen into a messy split? Or was she fully aware that the money funding her invoices wasn't legally his to give? Had she known she was stepping into a marriage, a business, a life she didn't build? The questions kept her awake that night. She lay in bed with the laptop open, scrolling through every email thread she could find with that name attached. The woman's tone was always professional, but there was something sharp underneath. A certain way she referred to brand direction that sounded less like strategy and more like controlled by midnight. She closed the laptop. She wasn't angry, not in the way she would have been months ago. What she felt now was something colder, a clarity that the younger woman wasn't just a shadow in the background. She had become part of the machinery that tried to erase her. But the difference was that her name, and hers alone, was on the foundation, and no invoice or email could rewrite that. She hadn't meant to look. The shared cloud account had been a relic of convenience. Created during a more trusting time, one email address, synced calendars, automatic backups. It was supposed to make things easier when they traveled, errands, juggled business and home life. After the split, she assumed he'd moved on to something else, that the account would fall into digital disuse like so many old files do. But one morning, while searching for an old supplier invoice, she clicked on the wrong folder. Inside was a string of emails entitled, unarchived, and very much active. She froze. The first message was from him to the younger woman. The subject line read, "New direction." It was dated 6 weeks before he left. The message wasn't personal. It was strategic. He wrote about how the brand needed to shift away from its small craft image and toward something more scalable. He referred to her as wife. At the time, someone not aligned with the next phase. And then in plain language, he wrote, "She's attached to the sentimental side of things. That's not sustainable. We need to rethink ownership." Her hands tensed around the mouse. The next email was a reply. The younger woman agreed. She suggested a subtle rebranding, changing the name slightly, modernizing the logo, even using a similar font to avoid raising questions. She listed packaging, vendors, web developers, and influencers who might help erase the older aesthetic. Erase, that word echoed as she read. The picture became clearer. They weren't just having an affair, they were plotting a transition. Not just of love, but of structure, of identity. They were preparing to peel her name from the very business she had poured herself into, as if she were a placeholder. The emails multiplied. Dozens of drafts, lists of domain names, even a mock-up of a new website, one that mimicked her original tone, but swapped out her handwritten notes for a sterile, clean-cut presentation. He had even discussed legal strategy in one thread, a message to a friend who worked in corporate law. "The business is technically hers," he wrote, "but I've been the face for years. That has to count for something, right?" The friend's response was cautious. "Not unless your name is on the paperwork. And even then, it's tricky." She sat in silence, rereading that sentence. He had known. He had known exactly how the business was structured. He had just hoped that branding, perception, and manipulation would be enough to push her out quietly. The emails went back nearly a year. Conversations about fundraising, using her success as a springboard for their own version, plans to reach out to her suppliers under the guise of new management. There was even a draft email to her most loyal wholesale client, written in her ex-husband's voice, announcing that the founder had stepped away and that the company would soon be under refreshed leadership. She read it 3 times. She never sent it. But he had written it. He had prepared for her erasure before she even knew there was something to fight for. She downloaded everything, every email, every attachment, every timestamp, saved them in a private drive, and made a duplicate copy for her attorney. Evidence, not just of financial manipulation, but of premeditated intent. That night, she didn't cry. She didn't throw anything. She didn't even feel the weight of betrayal the way she once might have. What she felt instead was a shift, a quiet realignment of power, because he had forgotten something. In all his planning, all his scheming, he'd never changed the cloud. Settings, never closed the folder. Never imagined she would look there, but she did. And now, she had the blueprint for everything he had tried to take. The law office sat above a florist and below an immigration notary tucked into the corner of a quiet downtown block. It was a Thursday afternoon, early spring. The air outside smelled faintly of lavender and exhaust. She wore a blazer for the first time in months. Not for formality, but for structure. For the sensation of fabric that reminded her she was not unraveling. Her lawyer met her in the waiting area with a warm nod and no questions. He had learned early on that she wasn't there to vent. She was there to organize, to respond, to build. They walked silently to his office. Once the door closed behind them, she didn't sit right away. Instead, she reached into her tote and placed a gray binder on the table between them. It was thick, labeled in capital letters, Discovery. He raised an eyebrow slightly and flipped it open. The first section was financial records. Every transaction flagged by the forensic accountant, annotated with notes, cross-referenced with corresponding bank statements, withdrawals, phantom invoices, untraceable payments, marked event expense. She had tabbed each one by date and added copies of statements from vendors who confirmed that they'd never received payment. The second section was screenshots. Email chains pulled from the shared cloud account, each one time-stamped. Conversations between her ex-husband and the younger woman, detailing their plans to rebrand, reposition, and quietly push her out of the business that bore her name. One message even listed her personal email address under the heading Legacy. Accounts need to close. The third section contained photos, a security camera still of the younger woman using the missing key to enter the warehouse after hours, close-ups of the petty cash drawer before and after, still shots from inside. The storage room showing boxes moved, items missing. She had printed each image on matte paper and wrote the date and time. Beneath them in pencil, the last section held a statement 3 pages, single-spaced, outlining the timeline of her discovery. It wasn't emotional. It was procedural. She had written it like a report, starting from the day she received the court summons and ending with the downloaded files from the cloud. Her lawyer didn't speak for a long time. He read the report, turned pages, studied the email printouts. Finally, he leaned back and let out a slow breath. "This changes everything," he said. She nodded. "That's what I thought." He pulled a legal pad toward him. "Here's what we do." The plan came in steps. First, a formal motion to amend the court's understanding of shared assets. Not a challenge, but a correction redefining the business not as marital property, but as an individually owned enterprise, supported by the documentation she'd provided. Next, a protective order regarding intellectual property, ensuring that neither her ex nor any third party could attempt to use the company's name, product designs, or client list without express permission. He paused, flipping through the binder again. "And then," he said, "we subpoena." She didn't flinch. "Subpoena who?" she asked. "The accountant who processed the phantom invoices, the travel agent who booked the resort stays, the web developer listed in the rebranding emails, and her." He didn't need to say the younger woman's name. She considered it. Not out of hesitation, but out of precision. "I want it clean," she said. "No theatrics. just accountability. He nodded. I can file everything by tomorrow. Stood, collected the binder, placed it back in her tote like it was any other errand. On her way out, she passed the receptionist, who smiled politely but with curiosity. She gave a soft nod in return. Outside, the wind had picked up slightly, blowing petals from the florists. Display across the sidewalk, she stepped around them without pause, keys already in hand. She hadn't cried, she hadn't yelled, she had brought a binder, and it was enough. The emergency motion was filed at 8:03 a.m. on a Tuesday. By 8:47, the court had accepted it for review. At 10:12, her lawyer received confirmation. The presiding judge had reviewed the documents and agreed. An injunction was signed just after noon, official binding, and immediate. It arrived in her inbox as a scanned PDF with the court seal in the upper left corner, stamped and initialed in dark blue ink. She read it twice, not because she didn't understand, but because seeing it in legal language made it real. Her ex was now barred from accessing the business in any form. He could not withdraw funds, contact vendors, alter branding, or communicate on behalf of the company. The court cited probable cause for misrepresentation, financial misconduct, and attempted intellectual property interference, now formally listed as a third party with no legal authority. She forwarded the order to the bank, the warehouse manager, and the supplier in Ohio, who had texted her last week saying, "He told me you were stepping down." Now, with this document, the message was different. There would be no confusion. He didn't know yet. According to social media still public, still curated, he was on a beach in Costa Rica. A picture posted the day before showed him in aviators and a linen shirt, arm draped over the younger woman's shoulders, both of them smiling under a striped umbrella. The caption read, "Starting fresh. Sometimes you just have to let go and move on." She didn't comment, didn't like the post, just saved the photo quietly into a folder marked public evidence. Her lawyer said it helped any documentation that showed intent to claim a new life. While undermining the old one, the court had moved fast because the evidence was airtight. Emails, financial records, timestamps. The forensic accountant's report alone ran 47 pages and mapped out every transfer down to the hour. The surveillance photos showed unauthorized entry. The emails detailed premeditation, and the shared cloud files, the ones he had carelessly left open, outlined the entire plan to replace her while retaining her work. What swayed the judge, according to her attorney, was the timing. The money transfers increased during the months leading up to the separation. The payments to the younger woman started before the business officially filed taxes. The draft email announcing new management was dated 5 weeks before the breakup. Note on the refrigerator, "It was too coordinated." To clean now with the injunction in place, any attempt by him to speak for the business, access its funds, or represent himself as affiliated would be in contempt of court by 3 p.m. Her inbox pinged again, a notification from the warehouse. Security system, unauthorized entry attempt. He had used his old keycard. She opened the security footage. There he was alone this time, dressed casually, as if stopping by out of habit. He swiped. The light blinked red. He tried again. Still red. He looked up, confused. Tapped the sensor like it was malfunctioning, then pulled out his phone, pacing. In a short circle near the door, no one came to meet him. The younger woman didn't appear. After 10 minutes, he left. She saved the footage, timestamped it, added it to the binder. He hadn't seen the order yet, but it had already started to change the story. She imagined him opening his email the next day, reading the words "temporary restraining injunction, civil division," seeing the phrase "immediate legal consequence." The sudden realization that the company he once helped run at least in appearance, was now locked to him in every sense. He wouldn't be able to use the business name, couldn't order supplies, call clients, or access the company credit card he had once freely swiped. On weekends in the city, any attempt would trigger a legal response. Every vendor had been informed, every password reset. On the beach, the sun was still shining, but the door had shut behind him. She didn't post a photo. She didn't say a word. She simply sent the court order out to everyone who mattered and moved on to the next page in her binder. The flight landed just after midnight, a red-eye back from Costa Rica, with stiff cabin air and the stale scent of recycled breath. He looked rested, tan, and vaguely irritated by the long customs line. The younger woman trailed behind him, scrolling through her phone, snapping quick photos of their matching luggage tags for what she later tried to post with the caption, "Back to business." But by then, business was no longer theirs to return to Dot. At the rental car counter, he slid his usual card across the glossy desk. The clerk typed in the numbers, then paused. A faint frown crossed her face. She tried again. The screen blinked red. "Do you have another card?" she asked. He laughed, polite but confused. "That one should work." "Try it again." She did. Still declined. He pulled out a second card. A company card, the one with the embossed logo. That card had always worked. Even when they'd been behind on bills years ago, that card had been the backup, his access to everything she built. It was more than plastic. It was convenience, power, identity, decline. This time, the clerk said nothing. She turned the screen toward him and let him read the message himself. Authorization blocked by issuer. He stepped aside, confused but still composed, tapping through his banking app with a rising pulse. Each screen loaded slowly, almost mocking him. When the main dashboard finally appeared, the numbers were wrong. Accounts he normally saw business checking, vendor payment float, marketing budget were gone, hidden behind restricted permissions. The balances were still there, but grayed out. Access unavailable. He tried the business email, password denied, reset request sent. No recovery email came through. His phone buzzed. At first it looked like just another batch of travel alerts. But as he read closer, the subject lines changed tone. Temporary injunction notice, asset protection filing, you have been named. Bank account authorization revoked. And finally, civil. Motion granted, notification of injunction compliance required. He opened them one by one, fingers moving slower with each click. The court language was cold and efficient. His access had been suspended by order of the court. All accounts tied to the business were now under the sole control of the legal owner. Attempted use would be considered a violation of the order. There were footnotes referencing emails, surveillance, forensic records. There were phrases that caught in his throat. With clear and repeated attempts to misrepresent ownership, pattern of unauthorized spending, coordinated effort to undermine sole proprietorship. The last email contained a scanned copy of the judge's signature, the sealed of the court, her name listed formally at the top of every asset. He had nothing to say to the woman beside him. She was still smiling at her phone, waiting for a rideshare to arrive. When she noticed his expression, she leaned in, whispering, "Everything okay?" He didn't answer. Dot in his pocket. His phone buzzed again. A message from his attorney. "We need to talk." Immediately, by the time they reached the curb outside the airport, his phone was nearly dead. No charger, no access to a company Uber account. The prepaid SIM card from vacation had already expired. She watched him hesitate on the sidewalk. For the first time, unsure where to go or how to get there, he ended up in the back seat of a taxian, old one with peeling upholstery and a silent driver who didn't bother with conversation. The meter clicked upward while he stared out the window, city lights blurring past. His briefcase sat unopened on his lap. Inside it were printed mock-ups of rebranded logos, partnership pitches, and a proposal to expand the business under a new name, all of it useless now. The warehouse had a new security system. The vendors had already been informed. The business accounts were frozen, but not to her, to him. He returned not to home, but to silence. The locks had changed, the access revoked. The foundation, he thought he'd quietly claimed, had shifted beneath him. And in that early morning darkness, as the taxi pulled away from the curb, he understood something he had never once considered. She hadn't just kept the company. She had watched him try to take it and closed the door before he even got home. The courthouse smelled faintly of disinfectant and dust, the kind of institutional stillness that made everyone speak in hushed tones even when they didn't need to. It was just past 9 a.m. when he walked through the heavy glass doors with his attorney in tow. His suit was pressed, his shoes recently polished. He wore a pale blue tie that someone must have told him brought out his eyes. His hair had been freshly trimmed. The younger woman was not with him. He smiled politely at the clerk, nodded to a guard, and looked around the hallway like someone scanning for a friendly face. When he saw her, he hesitated. She sat alone on the wooden bench, elbows resting on a neat leather folder. No makeup, no jewelry, except the one thing he hadn't expected to see, the wedding ring he had placed on her finger 3 decades ago. It caught the fluorescent light, dull with age, but unmistakable. Her face was calm. Unmoved, he approached with a measured step, uncertain, maybe expecting her to stand, maybe thinking she'd greet him. She didn't. She didn't even shift. Their attorneys greeted each other coolly. He tried to speak. "You look?" But she raised a single eyebrow and the words died in his mouth. The courtroom was small, modern, sterile, everything beige or navy. The judge's bench sat higher than the rest, towering over to long tables, one for each side. A bailiff called out instructions without looking at anyone in particular. He sat to the left, beside his lawyer. She sat. To the right, the case was introduced as a preliminary hearing on contested ownership of jointly operated assets. But the paperwork made it clear there was nothing joint about the structure of the company. Her name appeared on every LLC filing, every tax document, every licensing agreement since 2009. Even the trademarks were her signature beside. Each one, his lawyer tried to spin a different story. They presented PowerPoint slides showing photos of him at trade shows, video clips of him on Instagram promoting new product lines, records of business travel he had taken on behalf of the brand. They spoke of implied partnership, of contributions not easily captured in writing. She said nothing. Instead, her attorney opened the binder page by page. The courtroom watched as a story unfolded not of implication, but of documentation, emails, bank statements, screenshots, contracts, surveillance stills, each one time-stamped, verified, and introduced without emotion. When her lawyer presented the forensic accountant's report, even the judge paused to adjust his glasses. The other side objected, called it excessive detail. The judge allowed it. "This goes to intent," he said. "Continue." His hands fidgeted under the table. The nervous smile was gone now, replaced by the quiet flicker of recognition. Not just of what she had brought, but what he had left behind. She hadn't spoken a word yet. But when her attorney finished laying out the timeline of financial discrepancies, she opened her folder and handed over a single printout. It was a letter from the bank. It stated, unequivocally, that she had been the only signatory on the business account for over a decade, that no secondary access had ever been approved, then looked up at both parties. "Before we proceed further," he said, "you should both know where this appears to be heading." He turned to the other side. "Your client has no legal claim. What we're debating now is damages, not ownership." Her attorney remained still. His lawyer began to protest, requesting more time, more review, more context. Judge held up a hand. "You can have all the context you want, but if your client believed perception was ownership, he should have documented it better." She finally turned her head, looked at him just once. There was no anger in her face, just clarity, stillness, and 30 years of watching someone mistake proximity for possession. The judge's voice was even clear, almost conversational, as if the question had no weight beyond routine procedure. But as soon as it left his mouth, the entire courtroom seemed to pause. Even the rustling of legal pads and the clicking of pen stopped. "Who is the registered owner of this business?" The air felt heavier. He looked at his attorney, who hesitated before responding. There was no way around the question. No space for misdirection. No room for implication or shared effort or informal titles. This was not a matter of opinion. It was a matter of public record. Her lawyer didn't rise to object. He simply placed a copy of the official state registration document on the table. It bore a notary stamp, a date from 2009, and one single name in all capital letters, hers. The judge waited after a long pause. His attorney stood and said, "According to state filings, the business is registered solely under the name of the respondent. No further explanation, no qualifiers." The judge nodded. "And who is listed as the primary account holder for all financial instruments tied to the business." Again, her lawyer was ready. Copies of bank documents slid across the polished table. Account summaries, check authorization cards, merchant, service agreements. Her signature in blue ink was repeated on every page. His lawyer didn't contest them. The judge continued, his voice calm. "Have there been any formal amendments to ownership, such as shared equity agreements, silent partner, contracts, or filed revisions to the LLC. "No, Your Honor," her lawyer said. The judge turned to the other table. "Is that your understanding as well?" There was no answer for several seconds. Then finally, a reluctant "Yes, Your Honor," and yet the judge went on, flipping through his own copy of the binder. There are multiple instances in which the petitioner represented himself publicly as an executive officer. Hereat, a trade expo. Herein, an investor pitch. Herein, a press release that referred to him as co-founder. Her attorney didn't object. He didn't need to. The judge looked up. "Can you provide any document, any official record, that supports that title?" There was no response. The judge gave them time. He looked down, shuffled a few pages, then raised his eyes again. "I'm asking these questions not because I doubt the facts," he said. "They are abundantly clear. But because I want the court record to reflect, in detail, how appearances can differ from reality, and how that difference matters." He turned slightly toward her, though he didn't speak to her directly. This business was built under one name, funded, branded, and registered under one person. The law does not honor proximity or assumption, or what someone believes they're owed for their presence. He turned back toward her ex. The law honors paperwork, registration, ownership. Her ex shifted uncomfortably. His hands were folded tightly in his lap, his jaw locked, and "I want to be very clear on one more point," the judge said, now narrowing his tone. "Repeated withdrawals from an account to which you had no legal access, under the guise of business management, are not merely a misunderstanding. They are grounds for restitution and potentially further action." The courtroom remained quiet. Even the court reporter had slowed, each keystroke spaced with tension. And finally, the judge said, tapping the table lightly, "Do you, Mr. Langston, have any remaining documentation that proves co-ownership or legal claim to this business entity?" His full name sounded heavier than usual in that sterile room. "No, Your Honor," his attorney replied. This time, without hesitation, the judge nodded once. "Then we proceed from the understanding that this business belongs, in full, to Ms. Langston. All assets, profits, and liabilities will be treated accordingly." Her ex leaned back slightly in his chair, not dramatically, but enough to signal that something inside him had finally settled into place, something cold and final. She didn't look at him. She kept her gaze on the judge, still calm, steady. The questions had been answered, and the silence that followed was louder than anything he could have said in return. The clerk wheeled in the cart just after lunch recess. 3 neat boxes, each labeled with black marker: Exhibit A, Exhibit B, and Exhibit C. While the first 2 contained vendor contracts and banking records already reviewed, the judge had specifically requested that Exhibit C be entered next for the record and for clarity. Her attorney stood and explained, "Your Honor, Exhibit C consists of original filings, lease agreements, vendor onboarding forms, and digital service contracts, each one confirming the legal structure of the business, and more specifically, each one includes the registered owner's signature." He didn't need to say whose. The clerk opened the lid and began passing documents one by one to the bailiff, who brought them forward. The judge adjusted his reading glasses. He didn't rush. He reviewed each sheet in silence, lips tightening slightly as he flipped each page. They were methodical, almost boring in their repetition. Articles of organization, a 2009 vendor contract with a local wax supplier, a 2012 renewal for retail distribution in Vermont, a lease agreement for the warehouse, an insurance policy for business liability coverage. Every one of them bore the same signature, hers, blue ink, careful strokes, always dated, always notarized when required. He watched from the other table, motionless, except for the slightest twitch in his jaw. His hands were clasped again, knuckles whitening as the pages stacked higher and higher. The judge finally looked up. "I see no evidence of dual authorization," he said, "and certainly no countersignatures." Her attorney nodded. "Correct, Your Honor. At no point in the company's history has Mr. Langston been listed as a signatory or all filings have been made solely by Ms. Langston, with no legal amendments or co-filing status ever recorded." The judge gestured toward the documents, and this was by design. "Yes, Your Honor," the attorney continued. "She intentionally filed the business this way. It was her creation, her product. Mr. Langston was involved in operations at various points, but never legally. The phrase "by design" seemed to linger in the room. The judge turned toward him. "Mr. Langston, were you aware that your name does not appear on any official business filing?" His lawyer leaned in, whispering quickly. A short pause. Then the reply, he assumed it did. "Your Honor," he believed, given his time spent managing logistics and sales, that he was functionally considered a co-owner. The judge tilted his head. "Functionally, yes, sir. Assuming ownership because you helped run day-to-day operations is not equivalent to legal stake," the judge said. "It's not uncommon for spouses to play informal roles in small businesses. But informal presence does not imply formal control." He turned another page, pausing to underline a date. "Ms. Langston filed this lease in 2014. Her signature." "Alone, Mr. Langston? Were you aware of this lease?" "Yes, Your Honor, and you didn't question why you weren't required to sign." There was a long pause. "I trusted her," he finally said. "We were married. I didn't think it mattered." The courtroom remained quiet. She sat still, her hands folded over her knee, watching the judge nod him. She had heard that line before, in other forms. "I trusted you. I thought we were on the same team." But trust was never what he gave. It was what he assumed he deserved. The documents said otherwise. By the time the clerk stacked the final form back into the box, there were over 70 entries in Exhibit C, all signed. All hers. Not a single one bore his name, not even in marginalia. The judge rested his hands on the table and let the silence sit. "It's remarkable," he said, "how often power is assumed without being earned, how often people believe access means entitlement. But this court deals in what's written, what's signed, what's deliberate, not what's assumed." He closed the folder. Exhibit C will be accepted in full. The room had a strange kind of quiet that afternoon, the kind that doesn't come from silence alone, but from absence. One chair remained empty at the petitioner's table, though she had been named in the suit as a material witness and cited. In multiple filings, the younger woman had not appeared. There was no explanation, no letter of excuse, no video call, just a name on paper. In his seat, as the judge addressed the matter, "I see the co-named party has not responded to the court's request for appearance." Her attorney stood, already prepared. "That is correct, Your Honor. However, with the court's permission, we will enter digital correspondence from the absent party into the record." These were retrieved. Through subpoenaed access to the business email account, the judge nodded. "Proceed." From the evidence box, her attorney removed a series of printed emails, each marked with date, subject line, and routing information from the shared cloud service account. They weren't dramatic in tone, no shouting, no confessions, but in the context of the case, each line echoed with weight. The first email was addressed to a graphic designer. "Let's move forward on the rebranding. Use the new name we discussed. He says the ownership issue will be sorted out soon," dated 2 months before the injunction. The second was internal, sent to a former supplier. "We'll be taking over inventory decisions going forward. Please direct any communications to me or Mr. Langston. She won't be involved moving forward." Her attorney read that one slowly, word by word, pausing slightly before "she won't be involved." There were more in an email about a proposed website redesign, one that discussed login credentials and said, "Let's change all the passwords this week before she notices." Another flagged a conversation with an ad agency. "Use the new branding, not the old one. She's stepping down anyway. It's just a formality at this point." They kept coming. A particularly blunt message sent to a freelance consultant read, "He says she was just the face for tax purposes. It's really always been his. She'll get a payout, then disappear." No one looked at her as it was read. Final email was short, just 2 sentences sent at 2:14 a.m. on a Thursday. "If we take over by July, we'll beat her to the Q3 inventory. That gives us a strong case for primary control if anything gets messy." The courtroom sat in weighted silence. The judge didn't speak at first. He let the words settle. Her ex sat with his head slightly bowed now. His fingers twitched as he adjusted his collar, but he didn't raise his eyes. The attorney beside him avoided eye contact with the bench. The judge finally leaned forward, tapping his pen lightly on the desk. "Does the absent party have legal representation in this matter?" "No, Your Honor," her lawyer replied. "She was contacted. She did not respond." Then these emails, authenticated by digital chain of custody, will be entered into the record. Their relevance is not only clear, but central. He turned to the court reporter. Please make note that these communications confirm an active plan to misrepresent ownership and preempt control of company assets. Then, as if speaking not just for the record, but for the lesson behind it, he added, let the record also reflect that silence does not erase responsibility. Not showing up does not remove one's fingerprints from the decisions they tried to leave behind. She hadn't flinched once while the messages were read. She had heard it all before. Not the exact words, but the pattern, the quiet consolidation, the careful exclusion, the language that reduced her to a legal formality in something she built with her own hands. Now, those same words sat in the court record, not spoken in defense, but in evidence. The chair remained empty, but her presence in the plan was undeniable. And that, in the end, mattered more than whether she ever walked into the room. The moment came later than anyone expected. After days of documents, after questions that left no space to hide behind assumption or charm, after silence from the one person who had once stood at his side, his attorney hesitated before calling him. There had been discussion, whether it would help or harm, but, in the end, he insisted he wanted to speak. He took the stand slowly, almost stiffly, as though every step toward the chair weighed more than the last. He adjusted the microphone with a tremble in his fingers and cleared his throat twice before he said a word. At first, it was the usual language, words filtered through legal advice. To the best of my knowledge, in hindsight, what I understood at the time, his lawyer kept the questions controlled, focused, safe, but even the most carefully rehearsed responses couldn't shift what had already been proven. Ownership was not about memories or handshakes. The filings, the bank records, the signatures, those told their own story. His .wasn single quotes in it. Still, when it came time for cross-examination, she didn't speak. Her lawyer stood, not raising his voice, not pushing hard, just asking what needed to be asked. Mr. Langston, when did you last access the shared company email? He paused. Late June. Do you remember the subject of your final outgoing message? A breath. I told the supplier we were restructuring, and by we you meant yourself and Ms. Finley. He nodded. Yes. Did you consult with Ms. Langston before sending that message? No. The questions moved methodically, and with each one, something in him seemed to recede. His shoulders lowered. His hands, once tight around the microphone, began to open slightly in his lap. And then came the question no one prepared him for. Do you believe Ms. Langston contributed meaningfully to the creation of the business? He looked up. His mouth opened once, then shut. There was a long silence, and then, in a voice that didn't match the others, a quieter one, less defensive, he said, yes. A follow-up came. Do you believe her role should have been acknowledged more formally? Yes, and why wasn't it? He blinked hard. Not the dramatic kind, just once, a shift in breath. Because I didn't want it to be hers, he said. I thought if it was under her name, but I handled things, I could still claim it. The courtroom was still. No one interrupted, not even his lawyer. And when did that change? He took a long pause. When I saw the emails, he said. When I saw what we'd written, how we planned it without her, and I realized she hadn't left anything. We had tried to take what was always hers. Another pause. Then came the moment that stopped even the court reporter for a beat. She never tried to erase me, he said, even after everything. But I did that to her. And then, finally, after all the filings, all the silence, all the distance and names thrown around like cold weights, he said it. Maria built it. Not the respondent, not my ex, just Maria. The judge didn't react, not visibly, but he turned the page in front of him more slowly than before. His voice cracked slightly. I never said thank you, not once. He wiped at his eyes. Not theatrically, not performative, just quiet streaks across his cheek with the side of one finger, like someone startled by the feeling of their own regret. Her expression didn't change. She didn't move, but the courtroom did. You could feel it, as if some invisible current had passed through the air wand that couldn't undo what had been done, but made space for the truth to land. His tears didn't rewrite anything. They didn't change signatures or undo the ledger or reverse intent, but they made one thing clear. For the first time, he understood that what he left behind hadn't been hers to lose. It had been his. and he'd never noticed until it was gone. She sat still, hands folded in her lap, thumb pressed lightly against her knuckle, the same way she used to sit through school plays and dentist appointments, calm on the outside, a quiet swirl beneath the surface. Him. Not when he entered the courtroom that morning, not when he took the stand, and not when his voice cracked, saying her name for the first time in years. She looked ahead at the judge, at her attorney, at the court reporter's swift fingers. Moving across the keys, she nodded when addressed, passed papers when needed, listened carefully, but not once did her gaze shift toward the man sitting just a few feet away. He had looked at her, frequently, almost reflexively, as if waiting for something, a flicker of recognition, a softened glance, some trace of the woman who once said yes to him without hesitation. But there was nothing for him to find, because by the time he started crying, she had already done all of her grieving. Not publicly, not in any visible display, not even when she found the note on the refrigerator or the tagged photos from Belize. Her heartbreak had been quiet, compressed into motion, filed through paperwork and password resets, channeled into late-night inventory, counts and silent early mornings at the warehouse. So now, when his mouth trembled and his breath caught and he said her name, Meriwether, was nothing left to meet it. She didn't flinch, didn't stiffen, just kept her eyes on the judge as if his testimony were someone else's memory. In many ways it was, because the version of her he was finally seeing, the one with full ownership, the one he had overlooked all along. And now that he had begun to notice, it was too late to matter. The courtroom noticed her stillness. Even the clerk glanced up once from the exhibit list, as if searching her face for reaction. But there was none to find, no disdain, no satisfaction, just presence, quiet and deliberate. He talked about her on the stand, how she started the first batch of candles in their kitchen, how she spent weekends at artisan markets while he drove the van. He talked about her generosity, her steadiness, the way she never asked for credit. All the things he hadn't mentioned in depositions, now said aloud with tears in his throat, and still she didn't look at him, because this was not about recognition. It wasn't about hearing what should have been said. Years ago, it was about clarity, a line that had been drawn not with anger, but with ink, filing fees, and a forensic paper trail that told the story no one else had bothered to hear until now. When court adjourned that afternoon, she gathered her things calmly. Binder, pen, phone. She tucked her chair in, nodded once to her attorney. She didn't rush. He lingered at the other table, unsure of whether to stand or remain seated. His lawyer spoke quietly to him, but he didn't appear to hear. He looked over one last time as she walked toward the exit. His eyes searched her face again, maybe for forgiveness or understanding or even a shared memory that still lived in the space between them. But she didn't give it to him because it wasn't hers to give anymore. She had already given everything, her time, her trust, her labor, her name. And when she stopped giving, it wasn't out of spite. It was out of recognition that she had been the author of it all from the start, and that the story didn't need a final glance to be complete. She stepped through the heavy. The ruling came on a Thursday morning. No fanfare, no gasps from the courtroom. Just the rhythmic shuffling of papers, the sound of chairs adjusting, and the low clearing of the judge's throat as he opened the binder in front of him. He didn't look at either party right away. Instead, he kept his eyes on the document before him and read slowly, carefully, as if the words themselves held weight beyond their ink. In the matter of Langston v. Langston and Co., the court has reviewed all documentation, witness statements, and exhibits presented over the course of this proceeding. He paused to turn the page. Everyone in the room stayed still, based on filings dating back to 2009, corroborated by state business registration records, banking documentation, vendor contracts, and sworn testimony. The court finds that Ms. Maria Langston is the sole legal owner and founder of Langston Candle & Co. Her attorney gave a quiet nod, pen still resting against his notepad. She didn't react. Her hands remained folded neatly on the table. The judge continued. All assets and revenue derived from the business, including intellectual property, associated branding, warehousing, and physical inventory, are to remain under her sole control. Mr. Langston has no legal claim to present or future ownership, retroactive compensation, or percentage of profit. Across the aisle, he didn't move. His face was blank. His lawyer looked down, already anticipating the next motion. The possible appeal? But nothing about the moment suggested there was a crack left to pry open. The decision extended beyond the business. The property at 127 Glen Arbor Drive, registered solely under Ms. Langston's name since its purchase in 2016, is also affirmed as hers. No marital or business commingling of funds was proven sufficient to override sole title. The house, the one where he had returned to collect boxes as if it would remain partly his, it wasn't. The court further finds, the judge went on, that all operating accounts, vendor relationships, and associated business infrastructure are to remain under the management of Ms. Langston. Attempts to transfer or access said assets by any unauthorized party past or future constitute breach of civil code. It was stated clinically, precisely, no emotion in the tone, just facts, layered one after the other until no gaps remained. When the judge closed the folder, he finally looked up. This court recognizes that marriage can produce shared endeavors. But legal ownership, particularly in matters of business, depends on documentation, not proximity, not assumption, and certainly not sentiment. The evidence presented left no ambiguity. He leaned forward slightly. There is nothing here that was ever his. A soft murmur rippled through the benches in the back. Reporters, observers, the occasional law student scribbling notes. But none of that reached her. She was focused only on the words, the clarity of them, the line they drew through years of blurred understanding. Her name had been on every file, every account, not by accident, not as a favor, because it had been hers from the beginning. She rose as the judge stood. Her chair slid back with a gentle scrape, and she gathered her binder calmly. He didn't look at her this time. Not now. He just stared ahead, motionless, as if trying to understand what had already left his grasp. Ownership wasn't just about titles or deeds. It was about who had done the work when no one was watching, who had filed the taxes, who had remembered every cent formula by heart, and who had quietly signed her name year after year, while someone else assumed credit would catch up to Presence. Now, Presence had nothing to claim as she stepped out of the courtroom the midday. Sun caught the edge of her coat. She didn't hurry. She didn't smile, but her steps were steady, and the court had simply confirmed what she had always known. The request came quietly, after the ruling had been read and the courtroom began to empty. His lawyer approached hers, head slightly bowed, voice low and careful. He'd like a moment. Alone, if she's willing. She didn't answer right. Away, she stood still beside her chair, gathering the last of her papers. Her wedding ring, no longer worn, remained inside the zippered side pouch of her binder. After a pause that stretched just long enough to feel like a decision, she gave a slight nod. Nothing more. They were led down a hallway used by courthouse staff. The side room was small, beige walls, a single long table, plastic chairs. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered faintly and gave off a soft hum that never fully faded into the background. There were no windows, no portraits, just the soft presence of old air and something unspoken. She stepped in first, sat at the end of the table. He followed, slower now, as though the judgment had settled into his spine. He didn't sit across from her. He stood beside the chair and looked down for a long moment, fingers resting against its back, as though still deciding whether he had earned the right to take a seat. She didn't speak. He lowered himself gently into the chair, elbows on knees, hands clasped. Then finally he looked at her, really looked. Her face was unchanged, serene, composed, the same face he had once known in all its variations. Tired after long nights, lit by candlelight in their first apartment, turned away from him in recent years, and now resolved. Untouched by apology, he took a breath. I was wrong. For words. That was all he said. He didn't elaborate. Didn't cry this time. He didn't beg or explain. He had done enough of that on the stand, with his suit and his trembling voice and the sudden realization of everything he'd lost. This moment wasn't about the court or the house or the business. This was just him, stripped down to what remained when there was nothing else to claim. She looked at him once, briefly, and then away. Not coldly, not angrily. Just finished, there was a quiet in the room that didn't need to be filled. He didn't expect forgiveness. Not really. He didn't expect her to say anything at all, and she didn't. She rose slowly, smoothed her blouse, and reached for the door. He didn't follow, just watched her walk out. Not with drama, not with triumph. With the same calm she had carried through every deposition, every exhibit, every silence. In that moment, he understood that she had given him all the words she ever would. In the emails he never responded to, in the birthday notes he forgot to read, in the countless small decisions she made while he assumed she was waiting for his lead, she had spoken in years. In late-night labor, in quiet loyalty, in the name. She signed over and over again, believing he would protect what they built. She had said everything. Now it was his turn to sit with the silence, outside. She stepped into the hallway, the buzz of the courthouse returning like a soft static. Her attorney waited at the far end, expression unreadable. She didn't explain what had been said. She didn't need to. He would never know what she thought in that room, whether the silence was disappointment or exhaustion or something deeper. Mercy withheld, not out of cruelty, but out of truth. Some answers don't belong to the one asking, and some doors, once shut, don't open again. The hallway felt colder than the courtroom. Not physically, but in the way institutional buildings always did: sterile paint, dim fluorescent lighting, and the faint smell of old paper and carpet glue. People walked past slowly, murmuring to each other or waiting silently on benches. But for her, the noise fell away. Her lawyer stood beside her, shoulder to shoulder, saying nothing for a moment. Then came the envelope. It was plain white, sealed, a thin rectangle, no thicker than a single credit card. But the weight it carried was years deep. Her lawyer extended it gently. No ceremony, no congratulations, just a nod of confirmation. It's done, effective immediately. She took it with both hands, not because it was heavy, but because it deserved not to be fumbled. She held it the way you hold something final, something that cannot be undone. Inside was the title transfer. One page, folded once. The deed to the house, her house now, solely legally and without condition. No lien, no dispute, no future litigation, just her name spelled in full. Maria Ellen Langston, sole owner. She didn't unfold it in the hallway, didn't need to. The words had already been said in court. The judgment was on record. But this was the paper that made it real. The door behind her creaked slightly, and she didn't have to turn to know it was him. She could hear the difference in how he moved, now slower, unsure, no longer certain of his place in any space she occupied. He didn't speak. He stood for a few seconds, maybe watching, maybe regretting, but ultimately, he passed without pause, heading in the opposite direction. The sound of his shoes against the tile floor faded, and with it, the last shadow of a shared future. She tucked the envelope into her leather binder. Sliding it in between old receipts and bank statements, the layers of her survival pressed together. Like sediment, her lawyer turned toward the elevator, gesturing slightly. She followed, silent, one foot in front of the other. No rush, no stiffness, just steady movement. Exit long earned. Inside the elevator, the silence lingered. Of them needed to fill it. Her attorney had seen the arc of this case from beginning to end. The first consultation over chamomile tea and a manila folder. The forensic audit, the quiet injunction filed while her ex was on a beach. The day the photos appeared online, the day the missing funds were traced back. All of it had brought her here to this small elevator in a county courthouse, clutching a deed that never should have been up for discussion. When the doors opened to the parking lot level, daylight spilled in, a dull, overcast sky. No dramatic sunbeams, no cinematic glow. Just life, steady and unchanged. She walked out ahead. The pavement was still damp from the morning rain. She glanced at the space where his car had been earlier. Empty now, her own. Car sat quietly at the edge of the lot, where she always parked far enough to avoid dings, close enough to walk without strain. She reached it without looking back. No part of her needed to. What was behind her no longer required her attention. As she slid into the driver's seat, she placed the binder in the passenger chair. The envelope peeked slightly from its edge. She sat for a moment before turning the key. No music, just the soft hum of the engine. Her hands rested on the steering wheel. She didn't cry, not because it wasn't worth crying over, but because the tears had already come. Not in this building, but in years past. In quiet nights at the kitchen table, in whispered conversations with herself while restocking inventory. In the ache of watching her own generosity be taken for granted, that part was done. Now she had the deed not just to the house, but to the truth, to the work, to her name. She pulled out of the lot without hesitation. No one followed. The key stuck slightly in the lock, the way it always had. He jiggled it once, then pushed the door open. The apartment was quiet to quiet, that particular stillness that follows disappointment, the kind that doesn't announce itself but settles into the air like dust. Inside, the lights were off. The blinds had been pulled halfway, letting in a gray, indifferent light from the overcast sky outside. He paused just inside the doorway, listening, though he didn't know what for. A sound, a voice, something, but there was nothing. His bags dropped to the floor with a soft thud. He stepped forward, scanning the room. Everything looked untouched. No signs of movement, no dinner plates, no shoes by the door. Then he saw the boxers. They were stacked neatly by the sofa, 3 of them labeled in clean handwriting. Clothes, office, misc. Next to them sat the box he hadn't expected, the one marked yours. Inside his watch, his cufflinks, the leather wallet he'd stopped using, at the very top, folded precisely, was a t-shirt from a vacation in 2013, one he hadn't thought of in years. He walked slowly through the apartment. The bathroom was spotless. Her makeup was gone. So were the brushes, the little tray of rings on the sink. In the bedroom, the dresser drawers were empty. The closet, once cramped with overlapping hangers and too many shoes, now looked vast. Her side of the bed, though he wasn't sure which side it had been, really was undisturbed. And then he saw the note. It sat on the kitchen counter, propped against a water glass, written in black ink, on stationery he didn't recognize. Her handwriting, fluid, and even not rushed. "I thought you owned it." No signature, no goodbye, just that one line. He stood over it for a long while, read it once, then again, and again. The words didn't change. He ran a hand through his hair, leaning forward with both palms on the counter. The weight of the last week courtrooms, testimony, rulings settled like lead into his back. He had thought he owned it too, all of it. He had thought possession came with presence, that showing up late still counted as showing up, that having a hand in something meant you had a stake in it. Now this place, this apartment, was all that was left, and even it felt unfamiliar. Picked up the note again. The edges were sharp, clean. It hadn't been folded. She wanted it seen clearly. She had believed him once, believed in what he said, when he promised they'd build something together. When he handed her paperwork and said, "Just sign here, it's a formality." She'd trusted the version of partnership he presented, the version that didn't question whose name went where or who got listed as owner. Now the woman he'd left everything for had done the same. He thought she'd stay, that she'd be impressed by the business, the house, the stories, that she'd ride the wave of what he claimed was his. But when it came time for reality, when the court made it clear whose name was on what she had packed her things in silence. "I thought you owned it, not just the house, the company, the confidence, the future." But he hadn't. Ownership isn't in words, it's in the filing, the late nights, the follow-ups, the consistency, the name on the account, the one who signs the checks, not just cashes. Then, he slid down onto one of the bar stools, the note still in his hand. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound now. No one was coming back. Not her, not the one before her. For the first time, he realized the place he returned to wasn't waiting for him. It didn't hold memory, or promise, or anything more than walls. He looked around, then down at the note one last time before placing it, flat on the counter, smoothing it with his palm. He didn't move for a long time. The voicemail came late in the day, just as she was folding a shipment form and sliding it into one of the candle boxes. The warehouse had quieted down. The scent of amber and cedar still lingered in the air, warm and comforting. She hadn't checked her phone in hours, but when she did, the notification blinked once. New voicemail. She listened with half a mind, not expecting anything unusual. "Hi, this is Dana Ellis from the Post-Ledger. I'm reaching out because, well, I think you know why. I'd love to speak with you, if you're willing. Just a few questions. People want to hear your side. Are you the woman who won back everything without saying a word? She didn't move at first. The phone stayed in her hand. The box beside her remained half-sealed. Outside the warehouse windows, late sun filtered through like soft gold. She stared out at it, letting the voice echo back in her memory. Without saying a word, she didn't recognize the reporter's name. Probably young, probably hungry for a feature. But the phrasing lingered less about the business or the courtroom, more about how she had done it. And maybe that was what surprised people the most. Not the outcome, but the quiet. She hadn't yelled, hadn't posted, hadn't gone on morning shows or shared cryptic messages online. She hadn't slammed doors or burned photographs. She had signed her name, filled her paperwork. She had shown up, sat straight, wore her old ring because it made her hands feel steady. While he was busy talking, she had been documenting. While he posted vacation pictures, she built a paper trail. While he assumed she'd roll over, she called the bank, the accountant, the lawyer. Now someone wanted to tell that story, frame it, shape it, put her face next to a headline: "Woman wins back empire." Justice served quietly. The divorce that backfired, she imagined the comments, the speculation, the shallow takes. People deciding she was either cold or a hero, either too forgiving or not enough, either someone to admire or someone to mock. She placed the phone on the counter and returned to the candle box, pressing down on the flaps. The tape slid across with a satisfying zip. Another order, ready, another mark of continuity. A few minutes passed before she replayed the message. There was no malice in the reporter's voice, just curiosity, and maybe a little awe. That kind of reverence people feel when they realize the person they overlooked had been watching the whole time. She wasn't sure if she'd call back. What could she say that wasn't already recorded in court transcripts? What more was there to explain? That she had stayed because she believed in the business. That she hadn't left when he did because someone had to keep shipping orders and answering emails. She thought of the new interns in the back office, of the accountant who still double-checked every number with her before filing, of the brand she had kept alive through years of assumption. That was her voice. The business still standing, the clients still loyal, the candles still burning. Her silence had never been passive. It had been layered, deliberate, precise. She had known, long before the court did, what belonged to her. Still, she picked up the phone one more time, saved the number, typed a message, then deleted it. Not today. She didn't need her story rewritten. It was already in ink, on deeds in court rulings. In every receipt that bore her name and not his, she slid the next order onto the rolling cart, lit one of the tester candles by the packing station. Let the flames settle. Sometimes, not speaking was the loudest thing she could do. The email sat in her inbox for 2 days before she touched it. The subject line read simply, "Follow-up from Dana Ellis Post-Ledger." There was no pressure in the body of the message, just a kind tone, a few flexible dates for a potential phone call, and the offer to review any quotes before publication. It ended with a line that stuck out. "People find strength in stories like yours." She reread that line more than once. It wasn't that she didn't believe in stories. She had lived one, a quiet one, a slow one, a story that played out not in headlines or viral posts, but in long nights with receipts spread across the kitchen table. In the quiet filing of court motions, in showing up to meetings even when no one expected her to. Her story wasn't made of dramatic monologues or explosive revelations. It was made of facts, of names on documents, of choosing not to raise her voice, even when she had every right to. There had been a time, early in the unraveling, when she might have welcomed the chance to be heard. When her anger was new and hot, when the betrayal had texture. But the years had changed that. She no longer needed to be heard. She needed only to be free, and she was. The business was hers. The house was hers. The quiet was hers. She sat at her desk, the afternoon sun slanting through the blinds in soft golden strips across the floor. Her office wasn't grand. A second-hand desk, 2 potted plants she managed not to kill, and the faint scent of lavender and lemon from the day's candle pours. But it was hers. No one could walk in and take it anymore. No one could put their name beside hers and assume equal weight. She opened the email, typed a few words, stopped, deleted them. She closed the laptop instead and stepped outside. The air was warm, not stifling. The kind of warm that made people pause and roll their shoulders back just a little. She walked to the edge of her small garden and bent to pull a weed. It was a routine that grounded hurrying things that didn't require defense, negotiation, or proof. That was the difference now. Nothing in her life needed justification. She didn't need to correct the record. Let people speculate. Let them guess who had done what, who had said what in court, who had cried, who had won. She knew, the judge knew, her bank account knew, the deed in her filing cabinet knew. She thought about what the article might say, about how easy it would be for someone to twist her stillness into coldness, or paint her ex as a cautionary tale, while ignoring the complexity of 30 years, or worse, make the younger woman into a caricature, a footnote. The story would never belong to her once it left her mouth, and for once in her life, she wasn't interested in surrendering anything. Else, she stepped back inside, washed her hands, and sat down again at her desk. This time, she opened a fresh email, addressed it directly to the reporter, and typed only one line: "Thank you for thinking of me, but I'll be declining." She signed it simply, Maria. No need to explain, no need to soften, no need to invite further contact. She clicked send, closed the laptop again, and leaned back in her chair. Some victories don't look like confetti or applause. The world could talk if it wanted. She had nothing left to prove. The house was still, the kind of stillness that doesn't feel empty but earned. Outside, the porch light hummed gently in the background as the wind tugged at the trees. The day had ended with no fanfare, no big decision, no news cycle waiting to spin her name into someone else's idea of a headline. Just her. A full order queue on the warehouse dashboard. A kitchen that smelled faintly of vanilla from the grocery bag she'd unpacked earlier. She moved slowly, the way people do when they're not trying to get away from anything. She had opened the cupboard beneath the sink for a sponge and noticed it again tucked into the back corner, behind a row of folded dish towels, a small white candle in a cloudy mason jar. The label had long since peeled, but she didn't need it. She knew what it was. It was from her first batch. Not the first successful one, just the first. The wax had set unevenly. The scent ratio was too strong. She remembered thinking at the time that it smelled like someone had spilled an entire bottle of cedarwood essential oil onto a baking tray. But still, she kept it. Not for sale, just for her. She rinsed her hands, wiped them dry, and took the candle out. There was dust on the rim of the lid. She didn't brush it off. She just unscrewed it and held it close. It smelled like everything. She had forgotten she survived. The long nights testing formulas while he watched television in the other room. The early mornings boxing orders with handwritten notes before driving carpool, the arguments over money. The quiet frustration that came when people smiled at him and said, "You built something amazing." But this jar, this lopsided, little jar held the truth. It was before the logo redesign, before the business license, before the rebrand he tried to push through behind her back. Before any of it, it was hers. From the start, she set it on the kitchen counter, reached into the drawer and pulled out a lighter. The flame clicked on easily, small and steady. She brought it to the wick dot. It took a second to catch, then it lit, a tiny flickering flame that glowed soft gold and made the jar's imperfections look beautiful. She left it there, burning beside the bowl of lemons and the old recipe cards clipped. To the fridge with a magnet, the same fridge where not long ago he had left a note and walked out. That note was gone, recycled, shredded, whatever it took to make sure it no longer had weight. In its place now was a calendar with delivery, dates, a crayon drawing from her niece, and a magnet shaped like a honeybee. Sat at the table, let the scent fill the room slowly. No phones, no voices, no echo of litigation or betrayal, just her dot in her kitchen, in her house, with the business registered in her name, with the paperwork final, with no performance required. She sipped the tea and watched the candle flicker. It wasn't a ceremonial moment, no grand gesture, just quiet recognition that somewhere between the first pour of wax and now, she had stepped into her own life. People talked a lot about closure, as if it came all at once. But this didn't feel like closure. It felt like continuity. The candle didn't burn evenly. It leaned a little to one side, like the flame remembered the uneven base. But it burned steadily, warmly, without apology. She smiled, not at the candle, but at herself. Not for winning, but for staying. for staying with the thing she built when it was still small and uncertain, for staying with her own name when others tried to reshape it, for staying at the table after everyone else had pushed away their chairs. She let the candle burn until the flames softened to a low glow, blew it out, not to end the moment, just to carry it into tomorrow.